All right, great to see everybody for class this morning. We did put a new sheet on the table about 2 weeks ago. I don't know if we'll make it into that. We've got one thing to finish up in our study of the life of Noah before we get into that next series of notes. So we're still working off of the previous lesson. So let's be turning our Bibles to chapter 7 of Genesis. Chapter 7 of Genesis. So right now we are still on lesson number 6. If you're looking at the number of lessons that we're on, lesson number 6, and we're still plugging away at question number 2. We've got some things to discuss today under question number 2 that we did not get to finish the last time we were together. Genesis chapter 7. It is great being back with you. It doesn't matter how long we are ever gone. It feels like a year every time we're gone, and we weren't gone that long. We had the fall break for the girls. We had told them back around the first of this last year that we would, or the first of the year this year, back in December, January, that we were going to take them down to Orlando. There's a couple of theme parks down there, and we did the whole Disney thing a couple of years ago. We took them down to Universal Studios, which is like a big amusement park, and they've got some things in that the girls are very into and interested in right now. So we went down there and had pretty good weather the whole time. I think it sprinkled maybe one afternoon. Florida weather is pretty unpredictable because it can be forecast and then not do a whole lot, but we took them down to that. And then, of course, Sunday, beginning when we came back, we drove back and immediately turned right back into the gospel meeting up at Rockwood. So it feels like we've been gone an awfully long time, and appreciate we had some from the congregation. I know there's a lot happening last week with the funeral, but some were able to make it up to Rockwood, and we were very interested in a lot of the things in the history of that congregation. I was telling Art, and we ended up getting some information on it. Art will often talk about, in our songbook, A.W. Dicus, who wrote Our God, He is Alive, Lord, I Believe, and others, and we didn't know when I started the meeting, he actually preached at Rockwood many, many years ago, and so there's some interesting history there. And if you know the name B.C. Goodpastor, he was connected with that congregation many years ago. It used to be a much, much larger congregation decades ago, and it's since dwindled to about 70 members. So they're not a huge congregation, but very good people. We enjoyed being up there, but it sure is good to be back home. So we're glad to be here. And we'll finish up, the meeting schedule finishes up next month. I've got the last one of the year, which is the one at Sequatchie Valley. So if you're on the 12th of November, if you're around beginning that week, it's just a nice, beautiful drive over up to the Sequatchie Valley congregation off Highway 30 at the end where it meets in Pikeville, and then we'll be back. But almost felt like, but it hadn't been long, but I almost felt like saying, my name is David Smith. It's good to meet you guys. I used to preach here many years ago, but it hadn't been that long. It just feels a lot longer than it did. All right. So under question number 2 in lesson number 6, let me just read the question and talk very briefly about what we covered in the last class, and then get to the part that we've been saving for today, which is this. So let me read the question. How do we know that this was a universal flood? What language in the text helps us to establish this fact? And if you remember, we just took that first part of the question the last time. We looked at the internal evidence from Genesis in chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9 to help us to understand that when God told Noah he was going to flood the world, he wasn't talking about just a local place, but he was talking about the entire earth. And it was all covered with water. Even over the mountaintops it was covered. We talked about all that. And then we looked at the external evidence for that as well. There's a lot of external evidence for that. So we have confirmation from the outside and from the inside of the Bible about a universal flood. Now, the second part is this, and that's under question number 2. The second part is also from the language of the text, how catastrophic was the flood to the earth's climate, topography, geography, etc.? In other words, did Noah re-enter the same world he escaped, or was it different? And I don't mean a different planet. Did God take him off one planet and put it on another? We just mean, when he stepped off of the ark, did it look the same? Was it the same? Or had the flood significantly reshaped the world that he re-entered? What are your thoughts on that? What do you think about that? You think it was the same? Gene, thoughts?
I think it was drastically different.
Agree.
Prior to that, it was much like a greenhouse,
Okay.
which had pretty much a consistent climate across the entire globe.
Yeah.
And it had never rained. It didn't have the extremes in temperature that we have now. It was like being on another planet.
In a way, it was. Yes, Art, and then Tommy.
There have been some studies done when Mount St. Helens erupted and damaged it a lot, and then some of the changes in its earth that came because of rain and stuff like that.
Yes.
The way the canyons were formed afterwards.
Yes.
That resembles what we have, like in the Grand Canyon and other things, that indicated there was a catastrophic change that happened like that.
Yeah.
But it's also, they get, some of the scientists have said, hey, this is what happens when you have a lot of flood, and then things dry out, and then you have other catastrophic things that happen and occur. So we can see some things like that.
And on top of that, all those changes brought about by Mount St. Helens didn't happen over millions of years. It happened in a short span of time. So you can see in a more universal sense, earthwide, how that could explain how it essentially is an illustration of what happened during the flood. Tommy?
Well, not only that, we know that the water came from the earth
Mhm.
also. When you had the earthquakes and the volcanoes,
Yeah.
it broke up the ground, but when the water started going back, it went back into the earth, and the force that that water had
Oh, yeah.
moved stuff around.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. I think that's one thing we do. There's actually a Bible verse that tells us about formation of major mountains and ocean canyons during that time because things are colliding against each other. Yeah, Carl?
The whole earth was just more like green vegetation all over the earth, no deserts, no ice or anything. Or before all this, you think it was all about the same?
Yeah, and I think the language that Gene used is probably a really good description of it. It was very much because of the consistent temperatures. It's like a greenhouse. If you grow, for example, if you put out a garden and it's exposed to the elements, it's exposed to the sun and the heat and the rain and all of that, and you plant corn out in your backyard, and you have down the street a greenhouse with controlled temperatures, everything is just perfect, and they grow corn, whose corn is probably going to end up better? In the greenhouse, right? Because you have this controlled environment. So if you look at the difference between the two, and you can kind of just project that back and you look at what existed prior to the flood, I think the world would be very different. It would also help us to explain the ages prior to the flood because they lived exponentially longer because there were some things that they weren't exposed to that we are now exposed to. And there have been some studies to this effect. So we have some things prior to the flood. Now, I cannot prove it. I cannot prove it. But I think this goes to what Tommy was saying, that, and we'll make some suggestions as we go throughout this morning's study. I don't know that a world map, right, as we look at the earth, I don't know that the land masses as they exist now look like that prior to the flood. I think it was different prior to the flood. I don't know what it looked like. I have before, and I'm sure everybody has done it, when you look at a globe, for example, if you took major continents and you were to cut them out, they're almost like pieces of a puzzle. They kind of fit together. They seem like they originally were meant to go together, and something would have happened to make that different. And then I think probably we had some smaller hills and vales and things like that, but we'll talk about how major mountains and ocean canyons and things like that happened during the flood in just a moment.
I've always thought that a little bit more about the fountains of the deep.
Yes.
We don't know very much about that, and of course we know now there's some places in the ocean that are over a mile deep and things like this. And how much of the water went back into the core of the earth.
Sure.
We
Yeah.
don't understand any of that part of it,
We don't.
but it's kind of interesting to think about it.
It is interesting to think
God
about.
opened these fountains of the deep.
Yep.
We don't know what they are, where that water came from, anything about it. So it's interesting.
It is interesting. And let's just start right there. So let's let that be our first point in trying to understand how the world was reshaped while Noah was on the ark. Gene?
The satellites that we put up both on this planet and the other planet in our solar system, of all of those planets, only the Earth has a cracked mantle. None of the other planets do.
Right?
So something catastrophic happened that cracked the mantle in the Earth and caused all of that water and everything else to come up out of the inner part of the planet.
Yeah, it's without that, the mid-oceanic ridge is almost you can't explain it except that something catastrophic happened that would just crack it open, and we have Bible language for that. So let's start with this cracking open of the earth and the waters below the earth. Let's talk about that to the degree that we could understand it, and let's put ourselves in the shoes of Noah and his family, right? Because this is ultimately about Noah. It would be like us stepping into this building and being, for some reason, because of some catastrophe outside, and maybe we could say, not even water, let's just say fire, right? You step into this building, and they say there are some wildfires around. So we step into this building, and we're locked into this building for 30 days. We have to stay here for 30 days, which is nothing compared to what Noah and his family were on the ark. And then we go out those doors, and the entire landscape of Saudi Daisy is different. It would be unsettling. There would be something very, very odd and different, and everything, the entire ecosystem would have changed as a result of that. Right? So let's start there. Number one, we know for a fact, based on the Bible's language, that there was water below the earth's surface. We know that for a fact. So go back to chapter 2, Genesis chapter 2. We know this for a fact about the pre-flood earth. Okay, so as early as chapter 2 in Genesis, beginning in verse 5, well, we can start in verse 4. He said, "This is the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground." Verse 6, "But a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground." Now, when he says the whole face of the ground, how widespread was this mist that came out of the ground? Was it localized? Was it in certain areas, or was it over the entire earth? All right, anywhere where there was land, that land was watered by a mist that came up from below the surface of the earth. So we know in the language here there was water below the surface of the earth. So we have whatever the surface of the earth is, and below that is water, and it covered the whole earth. So below the entire earth is water. We would say this is subterranean water, right? Because below the terrain of the earth there is water, and there have been estimates and studies to suggest that likely half of what is now presently in the ocean once existed under the surface of the earth, under the crust of the earth. That there would be room for it, at least there would potentially be room for it. So a lot of water below the surface of the earth. Yes, Tom?
Even the scientists have come to the conclusion now that with instruments, don't ask me what kind, that there's several times the volume of water below the crust, in the crust of the earth than there is in our ocean.
And that's something. I mean, it's just staggering to think about that.
You can believe what they say, that's
Right. If those studies are true, just staggering.
so-called proven fact.
Yeah. Okay. Drop over to chapter 7. Go back to chapter 7. And earlier, Art used this language drawn from the Bible. And look at verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were open. Now, when the language is used, the fountains of the great deep, and even the language, the great deep, what does that tell you about the volume of water that would have been below the surface of the earth? It's massive. I mean, I just think the language itself is intending to convey that there's a lot of water below the surface of the earth. So it was just a little bit that would just seep up through and miss the earth. There was access to a lot of water below the surface of the earth. Now, on top of that water is the earth's crust, right? So back in chapter 1 of Genesis, when during the creation week, the Bible says, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place and let the dry land appear. We're talking about the dry land. We're talking about the water that sits now, what we know upon that the earth, that sits upon the water under the earth. So you have this subterranean water, likely with interconnected chambers, potentially up to a half-mile thick of water, forming a complete shell of water around the earth's surface. But then you've got crust on top of it. Now, how deep is the earth's crust in some places? A couple 100 feet? Miles deep in not just shallow, but very, very deep. I mean, you're potentially talking, even in shallow areas, 10 miles deep of land that sits on top of this channel of water that's covering the surface of the earth. So it's very, very heavy, very weighty.
Another thought too, if this was catastrophic, if this had happened slowly, didn't some of these guys who lived back then go fishing or have boats or floats or something out? I don't know, but could somebody have figured out, hey, I could build something that will float on top of this? It happens so, look at the animals that they have found that have been fossilized that still have leaves in their mouth.
Sure.
Things like that, and they're not having digested.
Incredibly sudden, which I also think is why, at the end of Matthew 24, he'll use Noah and the timing of the flood as an illustration of being ready for the Lord's judgment, because he'll talk about the unpreparedness of the people in that day. I think that's an excellent point. All right, so you have water below the surface of the earth. That's not the only place where water was found in the pre-flood world, because there was also a massive amount of water where, do you know? All right, above the atmosphere. So go back to chapter 1 of Genesis, if maybe you're still there from our last reference, and notice verse 6. Then God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. So God made a firmament, your Bible might read expanse, and divide the waters which are under the firmament from the waters which are above the firmament. It was so. So the expanse is our atmosphere, okay? So at the bottom of the atmosphere would be land, because land meets our atmosphere, but below that would be water, because we know there's subterranean water. But we now also know that above that is water, what some have called a water vapor canopy that existed above the atmosphere. So below the earth's crust and above our sky was a complete layer of water on both ends. Water surrounded both of them. And some studies have shown the ability of that water vapor canopy to provide that greenhouse type effect, blocking harmful UV rays and things of that sort, to provide consistent temperatures and things of that sort. But we have water below and water above. Now, something in history happened. It's not a mystery, because we know exactly what happened to cause that crack in the earth's crust, and it was God opening up the windows of heaven and cracking open the fountains of the great deep. Now, in chapter 7, go to chapter 7. Listen to the language again in verse 11. It said, on that day, and that would be 600th year of Noah's life, 2nd month, 17th day of the month. On that day, all the fountains of the deep, and what does the Bible use language-wise here? Were broken up or burst open, right? Cracked open. And so God split open, He cracked open the earth's crust. The crack would have stretched the crust, splitting the crust in both directions. And we do not know the speed at which it went. But if we take, for example, let's just say that we were to take we took an average of 3 miles per second. And that's not unreasonable when you consider that water was under the entire surface of the earth. It would have meant that the crack would have reached the entire globe in about 2 hours. It could have encircled the globe in about 2 hours, the catastrophic nature of this. But He rips it open, and of course, with the water underneath, all it takes is literally just in a few spots of cracking it open, and the force would have done the rest of it because of the force that was under it. But you've got all this subterranean water. Now, let's think about what would happen here. Even though I certainly think these things are implied, we're certainly meant to get a word picture from this. If you have miles and miles of the surface of the earth, let's say in some areas 10 miles or more deep of the earth's crust, which is, I don't even know how you would measure the weight of that, just astronomically weighty, and you push down on the water, and there's a crack in the crust, and this goes back to what Tommy was saying a while ago. What happens to that water? It comes flying out from underneath. All right, so water would come from below the earth's crust. Now, I think we have a description of that in chapter 7. So look, we saw verse 11, the fountains of the great deep were broken open. And we also have the windows of heaven being opened. So you have all this water above the atmosphere that's coming down. And notice verse 12. Rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day, Noah and Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's wife, 3 wives' sons, they went with them, they entered the ark, right? So they're in, and then the rain starts. But now, even in verse 12, that rain is not simply from the windows of heaven being opened, because it's being added to by what? Water that was originally under, that's shooting maybe 20 miles upward into the sky and mixing with that and coming back down. So, I mean, we've seen heavy rain before, but nothing ever like this. It's just unimaginable the amount of rain that is falling down. Verse 14, they and every beast after its kind, all cattle after their kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. And they went into the ark with Noah, 2 by 2 of all flesh, which is in the breath of life, or in which is the breath of life. So those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut the door. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The water increased. We would expect that. I mean, you got all this. It wasn't over an hour later that all the water had been exhausted under the surface of the earth. You've got just exponential amount of water, unimaginable amount of water that's still continuing to be forced out, and water that was above the atmosphere and this water vapor canopy that's being forced out, and it's just continuing. So the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased, and they lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. We can see it. It's just like pouring water in a bathtub. And if we can imagine that the bathtub itself, the floor of it is the earth's crust, it's being submerged in water because of the influx of massive amounts of water. Verse 18, the waters prevailed, and greatly increased. Are we noticing the language that God continually saying? It just kept on. And it's increasing, and it kept on because of the massive amount of water until all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered, because the earth's crust is dropping down where some of the volume used to be, because the water is now on top of that. So the next thing we know is that there was water from below the earth's surface. Again, if you have 10 miles in some places of crust pressing down on subterranean waters, you would have water exploding upward. Some have suggested, because they've done volume studies of the earth's crust, that if that were to happen, and they always state it hypothetically, if that were to happen, they said it would have had the force, the downward force of about 10 billion hydrogen bombs pushing down, which we could see would have catastrophically changed our world. Water would have shot upward, maybe likely 20 miles into the sky. So you would have had, or we would have had in that moment, superheated water and steam, which would have created violent winds affecting the stratosphere. And so we would have had water and animals and plants being frozen because of the mixture of all of that at high elevation, and forming ice crystals when it falls back down. And when people talk about the ice age, they always talk about an ice age as this catastrophic meteoritic event. It was not a meteoritic event. I don't doubt that you had chunks of rock being thrown up into the sky from the earth's crust, but I know that in history there was a moment when things were getting frozen. It's because that was during the flood, and water was freezing and coming back down. And so that ice age they refer to happened during the time of Noah. But we would have had superheated water and steam with violent wind. And then that ruptured earth, plus the heat, plus the wind, and plus the water would have caused, and I think Art just made allusion to this a moment ago, would have caused the formation of the fossil record, because these sediments would settle and the fossil record would have been formed, because vegetation and animals would have been immediately trapped in this cataclysmic mush of stuff that was coming out as a result of that. Vegetation would have been almost immediately turned into coal and oil, but it happened quickly. And one of the ways we know all of this happened quickly is that in the fossil record, you see these big slates of the fossil record. One of the things that appears so often in the fossil record are these big palm fronds. You see these palm branches. How resilient are palm trees to storms? Very, right? You can see hurricanes, and you see houses being tossed to the side, and yet in the distance, you always see palm trees, and they're leaning over and blowing in the wind. And when the storm is over, where are the leaves to the palm tree? They're still on the palm tree. I mean, occasionally you might have one on the ground, but it's not likely that they come off. They're extremely resilient. And so when you see so many palm fronds embedded in the fossil record, it tells you that whatever it was not typical. This was something cataclysmic that transpired. Not to mention, I think we dealt with some of this in a recent bulletin article, is that we'll talk about this in a second. When you look at the Grand Canyon, you see that pancake layering in the Grand Canyon. And you see the massive amount of water cavitation that would likely have occurred as a result of that. You just have, the only way to explain that is the flood of Noah, with all the earth being ruptured open and the heat and the wind and the water. It would have just been the only explanation for the formation of the fossil record. So, then you have, are you raising your hand? Okay, sorry, Terry.
Well, there are other evidences that shows this happened immediately.
Oh, yes.
One, you may not be familiar with, when moisture in a plant dies, it's over.
Yes.
Just recently, in a field in Alabama, they have found a field, and there are oysters in the field.
Interesting. Trapped that way instantly, yeah. Very, very interesting. There's just so many evidences for that. You can't deny, an honest person would not deny what that points to. The next thing would be that erosion would widen with the rupture, right? So as the rupture occurred, the erosion would be wider. The width of the rupture would grow. Compressed rock would have sprung upward, right? So there would be crust pushing upward, and you can still see it. You do sort of these from a space image shots of the Earth's crust, and you can see the mid-oceanic ridge just sort of wrap around. And then, while we don't know, what it would have looked like, I just can only imagine what it would have looked like. I'm going to draw our attention to a Bible verse that sort of fills in this blank for us, which is that if you have, all right, so if I take something and put it on top of water, even though it's heavy, if I release it, until the water is gone, what happens to that whatever I'm putting? Does it stay stationary or does it move? It's moving. So let's just say that you open up the crust of the earth and you have a pushing up of the crust, and this is still on water. What happens to this plate of earth that I've got? It starts sliding out. And let's say it starts meeting with another that's sliding from another direction, and this earth that's just massive comes together. What happens to it? It starts pushing up in some areas, and then in the areas where at the base of it is pushed up, you start having a pushing down. And what we have is the formation of usually mountain ranges that are associated in some way with the oceans, and the deep ocean valleys that have done that because the earth's crust is colliding together. So turn your Bible to Psalm 104. Psalm 104. Psalm 104. Oh, yeah. I mean, how did that happen except in this? All right, so I'm going to pull up my Bible. Is anybody using, I won't have to use my app. Has anybody got ESV? Somebody have the ESV, English Standard Version? I'll pull it up on my app. Okay. I normally read out of New King James, but I'm going to pull it up on this too, because I think the rendering is a little bit better in ESV. So let's look at Psalm 104. All right, so look at verse 5. You who laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever, you covered it with the deep as with a garment. What's he talking about there? What is it? That's the flood. He's talking about the flood. The waters stood above the mountains. Is that the flood? That's the same description back in Genesis, because water exceeded upward above the mountains, by enough that the ark would never be caught on any of those mountains. At your rebuke, they fled. What's that? That's the water receding, right? At the voice of your thunder, they hastened away. The they there would still be the waters of the flood. Now watch verse 8. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valleys to the place which you founded for them. And that's not really the best translation of that. It's a hard phrase to translate, but translated it would sound something like this. And I do like the way the ESV does this a little bit better. So it says, verse 7, I'm going to read out of ESV, and it's the same in New American Standard and a number of others who've caught the language here. It says, at your rebuke they fled, at the sound of your thunder they took flight, the mountains rose, and the valleys sank down. What's the time context for that? Is that creation or the flood? It's the flood. And he said, in the flood, the mountains rose and the valleys sank down. Because when you have a buckling of the earth in the same place that you would have an upward movement of some of the earth, what happens at the base? You have a sinking of it. So you have a formation of that valley in the ocean. So he says, at your rebuke they fled. At the sound of the thunder they took flight. The mountains rose and the valley sank down in the context, the time context of the flood. Because if you look, right, all of those mountain ranges and the deep ocean valleys, they're parallel to each other. They always correspond to each other because where one was pushed up, the other sank down. I would say, I think we stand on good ground to say that when Noah exited the ark, it didn't even look the same as when he went in. It was different. The topography was different. The climate was different. Everything about the earth had changed, right? There's still ground. He's on ground, and water is water. But the way it looked, And the way now that the world was interacting with itself was different because the removal of the water vapor canopy, subterranean chambers had been emptied, mountains had been formed, and ocean canyons had been formed. It was just completely different. Now, I will say, just as an aside, there is great evidence that exists for post-flood lakes, where you have some of these depressions, you end up with post-flood lakes. There is evidence for a huge post-flood lake at the corners of Utah and Nevada and some of those places that when they would have spilled over at their lowest point, and well, you know how water cavitates, right? You can even take a water hose, and if you turn your water hose down to where you get your jet stream and you put it in the dirt, does it cavitate the dirt? It just pulls it right up. All right, so if you have these post-flood lakes that are pushing out at their lowest point, it wouldn't take long with water cavitation to form these big canyons that we have available to us, and the greatest of which we have right now is the Grand Canyon, which would have been formed probably in just a matter of a couple of weeks from one of these post-flood lakes like at the corner of Nevada and Utah and some of these places that would have poured out. And you can kind of see that as it forms a canyon. But our point is the world was completely different. Do you think now, because we're going to discuss this next time, do you think that there would have been an emotional, even a psychological effect on any of us had we walked out and the world would have been so radically changed? And when you enter the ark, there was billions of people in the world, and you walk out and it's completely dead quiet because there's no one left. Is that a lot to put on your shoulders? Yeah. It would have greatly affected Noah and his family. Okay, so we'll talk about how do you deal with that? How would he have dealt that? We'll talk about that the next time. Any other thoughts on this? I think our point today was to prove that the world radically changed because of the flood. That's just the nature of a universal flood. Any thoughts on that? We'll try to talk about the emotional impact of it on Noah.
What would be your reaction when the first bout of rain came after that?
I mean, can you imagine the first? You've never felt rain. You know, can you imagine the first raindrop? And it wasn't just one drop of rain, and 16 hours later another drop of rain. It just that was it. Because not only are you seeing rain drop from the sky, you're feeling the movement of the earth as it cleaves open, as God breaks it open. I don't know that any of us have ever felt ground shake like they would have felt shake back then because of what God was doing to the earth. And it was just in one moment. It just started, and that's when it all started. Almost unimaginable. It's certainly believable. We know it happened. It's just hard for us to imagine how cataclysmic this was. But along with those types of events, I mean, even today when we have sort of world-changing events, there's an emotional component that goes along with that, a spiritual and emotional and psychological component that goes along with that. And Noah was being asked to bear the brunt of that. So we'll talk about that next time. So if you don't have a copy of Lesson 7, be sure to get that, and we'll plug away at that. But thank you so much for your input. It's certainly a lot to think about, I know, but hopefully it makes us think a little bit more about the flood. I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.